Good evening, everyone. My name is John Tates, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that McNally Robinson is located here in Treaty 1 territory. That is, of course, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Anishinaabe, Innuit, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, of course, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are gathered here today to celebrate two books, two new publications from our good friends at CMU Press. Those are, of course, New and Selected Poems, Volume 1 in the Lyrik Poetry Series by Sarah Klassen, and On Mennonite's Writing, Selected Essays by Hildi Froese Tiessen. We have a very stacked lineup of readers and conversationalists here this evening, so I won't take up too much of your time. This event will be hosted by Sue Sorensen from CMU Press and the conversation hosted by John Weir. Now, just to give you an idea of how the evening will flow, we'll have a series of readings from this podium here before we move along to the conversation, which will take place at these stools to my left. Following that, if time permits, there may be an opportunity for questions. So if we do have time for questions, I will circulate with this handheld microphone, not because we don't believe you can project, but just to ensure that those watching at home can hear your questions. And if you are one of those folks joining us on YouTube, please feel free to write any questions you might have into the chat, and we will put them to the authors as time permits. Now, this seems particularly appropriate given that we have had the pleasure of launching one or two books from Mennonite authors here in the atrium over the years. So we're completely thrilled that we can launch not only an incredible collection of poetry from one of the most monumental Mennonite authors today and of all time, I would say, and also a book that so incisively and brilliantly takes a look at the Mennonite canon as well. So we're very gratified to the authors for being here and of course to CMU Press for publishing these volumes. If you are in the back and would like a seat, I will assure you there are some seats over there and there is an aisle in the middle, so you won't have to crowd surf to get to them. Now, it is my great pleasure to call up the publisher of these books to introduce the evening. Your host, Sue Sorensen, is a Winnipeg poet, novelist, professor, and director of CMU Press, and her naturally humble biography does not note, but I will note, that her brilliant new collection of poetry, Acutely Life, was just recently published by Winnipeg Press, so you should avail yourself of a copy if you have not already. Please join me in welcoming the wonderful Sue Sorensen.
Thank you, John. One of the easiest tasks for someone who's starting off one of these events is to thank McNally Robinson and to ask people if they think, you know, is there any other bookstore this good in Canada? And we all know that there isn't. So thank you so much to John and to McNally Robinson. He likes to do his puppet show. So thanks to all of you for coming tonight to help us celebrate these two fine authors, Sarah Klassen and Hildi Froese Tiessen. Both of the books that you'll learn about tonight are, in a way, greatest hits collections that commemorate many decades of writing and publishing. And from the point of view of being their publisher, each of these books was several years in the making. And so I want to give a few quick thanks. I want to extend my gratitude to the designer of both these beautiful books, and I hope you agree that they are beautiful, Nathan Dueck, who is also my good friend. Thank you, Jonathan, for your hard work, your patience, and for the love of books that you share with me. My gratitude also to the editors of these two books, both of whom I hope are watching us online. They live in different provinces. The editor of On Mennonite's Writing, Robert Zacharias. It was a pleasure to work with him, and he worked very hard on Hildi's book. And the editor of New and Selected Poems of Sarah Klassen is Nathan Dueck. And I hope they both know how much I value everything they did to make these books happen. on the ground at CMU Press, which some of you know really doesn't have any actual employees to speak of. I nevertheless have enlisted the help of Katie Doak-Sawatsky in Regina, and here in Winnipeg have been helped by Phil Waldner, Theo Sorensen-Kurtz, and Filippo Abranica. And both of these books received very useful and welcome financial contributions from the MB Historical Commission, and I'm grateful to John, I think John Isaac is here tonight. Thank you to the MB Historical Commission for helping us to publish these books. In our promotional materials for both of these books, I think I've used the word honor. These books honor two perceptive, generous, intelligent, industrious Mennonite writers. But really, I am honored, and I hope you are honored. I am honored to know these two people. I'm a latecomer to the Mennonite community, but to have the privilege of getting to know Hildi Froese Tiessen and Sarah Klassen is a distinct honor. Their careful, beautiful writing, their humility, and their openness to all sorts of ideas, these things make them very special indeed. And yes, CMU Press has published these books to honor their contributions to Mennonite literature and to Canadian literature. But I believe you will agree with me that we should all be honored to be in their presence and to have the opportunity to read their work and get to know them. So this evening, we do have two books, so there will be sort of short readings and then a conversation. I'll introduce Hildi first, and then after she's done, I will introduce Sarah, and finally I will introduce John Weir, who will take over the conversation. Hildi Froese Tiessen was raised here in Manitoba and educated at University of Winnipeg, later earned her graduate degrees at University of Alberta. She taught English and Peace and Conflict Studies at Conrad Grebel University College, University of Waterloo, where she also served as academic dean. She's the editor of Liars and Rascals, which is an anthology of short fiction by Mennonite authors, and with her husband Paul Tiessen, who's also here tonight, has done all sorts of publishing and editing projects, including After Green Gables, Ellen Montgomery's Letters to Ephraim Weber. As a publisher, you get to seek out these things called blurbs, promotional blurbs. And when we asked for blurbs about Hildi's book, they came in almost immediately. So this is what poet and academic Jeff Gundy sent us practically the next morning after we asked if he would like to send us a comment about Hildi. Hildi Froese Tiessen has played an essential role in the remarkable flowering of Mennonites writing over what is now half a century. The publication of this volume of her essays reveals anew the great generosity, critical acumen, and encyclopedic knowledge that Tiessen has offered to the Mennonite writing community, one that she has actively nurtured and guided into being. So now, please help me welcome Hildi Froese Tiessen.
Thank you, Sue. Good evening, everybody. What a treat to see all these people here in my hometown. This is really, really close. I wonder if we can move it. I think I can't read my text. I'm almost a bit flustered because I decided to take a minute out in the mall while I was waiting to come in here. I got locked out of the store. Oh, so I was a bit flustered. But this is sort of home territory for me. I'm immensely grateful to Sue Sorensen, my publisher, and John Taves at McNally Robinson, which truly is possibly, quite probably, the greatest bookstore in Canada. I think Winnipeggers should be reminded of that. Well, they don't need to be because they know that. But it's, as someone who hasn't been here for a while, I'm stunned once more, not only at the array of books, of course, that are available but at events like this. And no trip home over the past decades has ever been complete for me without a trip here to McNally's. I grew up in East Kildonan and left Winnipeg and long ago, but I'm always happy to come back. It was a warm surprise, and I'm going to read some text here for you now. In August 2022, when Rob Zacharias, who's leading scholar among a new generation of critics of Mennonite literature, picked up a conversation he had initiated with me 10 years before and suggested that he'd like to edit for publication a selection of essays I had written over the past 15 years. Ooh, I feel so old saying that. At the time, I had been officially retired for a decade, but had continued to work in the field of Mennonites writing. Rob, a young prof at York University now, had by that time published a few major critical studies of Mennonite literature himself. My many thank yous to Sue and to Rob will never sufficiently acknowledge the work they put into this collaborative project that we're celebrating here tonight. So let me tell you a little bit about this book. I'll remark, first of all, that although On Mennonites Writing is a work of literary criticism, you don't have to be a literary critic to read it. And if you do choose to pick up a copy of the book, you don't need to read it from front to back, though you could. It's a text you could roam around in. And in the next few minutes, I'll roam around in it a bit, directly quoting passages here and there, but mostly telling you something about what sorts of things the book addresses. On Mennonites Writing offers a kind of historical survey documenting the emergence of Mennonite literature across North America. We often think of Rudy Wiebe as the father of the phenomenon we now speak of as Mennonite literature. And to be sure, he was the first Canadian Mennonite to produce a major work in English. He was living here in Winnipeg when his controversial first novel, Peace Shall Destroy Many, appeared. But it was the next generation of writers, many of them perhaps 15 years younger than Wiebe, and most of them nurtured in Mennonite communities in southern Manitoba, who exploded conspicuously onto the scene of Canadian literature in the 1980s. You know the names. You see the pictures around the bookstore: Patrick Friesen, Di Brandt, Sandra Birdsall, Armin Wiebe, David Walter Taves, John Weir, Sarah Klassen, and then David Bergen and Miriam Taves, and many others, of course. These were the writers who put Mennonite creative writing on the map of our national literature. Andrus Taskins, publisher of Manitoba's Winnipeg's premier literary magazine, Prairie Fire, referred to the phenomenon these writers represented as comprising a kind of Mennonite miracle. In the 1980s, the multicultural literatures of Canada, which now dominate the literature of this country, were poised to break through into the front ranks of serious creative writing. From our perspective now, we might imagine that the minority culture texts that make up the landscape of Mennonite Canadian literature, were always part of the matrix of CanLit. But with the exception of an earlier cohort of Jewish writers in Montreal, Irving Layton, Mordecai Richler, Leonard Cohen, for example, it was the Mennonite writers writing in the last decades of the 20th century who in large measure led the way to the elaborate literary mosaic we think of today as Canadian literature. In an essay included in this book entitled Critical Thought in Mennonite Literature, I wrote, quote, "As the Mennonites well know, communities are not uniformly eager to hear what their writers have to say. For literature reveals a community to itself as no other field or discipline is likely to do, because it takes liberties in pursuing so freely what we conventionally refer to as truth, because literature is, by its very nature, unruly, because it presumes to enter the territory of human intimacy." Rudy Wiebe observed in 1990, I quote Rudy, "I see no point in writing imaginatively unless it is done with both the critical coldness and an intense compassion, the simultaneous brilliance and stupidity of human beings deserves nothing less." The essays in this collection speak to the often troubled relationship that in many cases existed between Mennonite writers and the communities that nurtured them. So many Mennonite writers, Rudy Wiebe, Di Brandt, Miriam Taves, for example, offer unique perspectives on this challenge. At what point did Mennonite writers decide that they didn't need to abandon their community when they began to write? When did they decide that they could both speak out and refuse to go away? That they didn't need to choose between what Di Brandt inimitably called the worldly world and the Mennonite world that had been their home. The ambivalence so many Mennonite writers felt, especially in the early years, about their place in the communities they once called home, resonates in the background of many Mennonite literary texts. And how do we deal with that pesky problem the name Mennonite itself presents? Does the term refer to a religious denomination, an ethnic heritage? That line between religion and ethnicity, where does it belong? Is it ever fixed? To what extent does it matter? What about the use of the word Mennonite to describe a literary phenomenon? When we assemble essays on Mennonites writing or gather to celebrate Mennonite writers, as many of us interested in this literature have done at intervals over the past several decades, what sort of assumptions are we making? What commonalities are we giving expression to? On Mennonites writing speaks to such things as Mennonite writing in the context of post-colonial and post-colonialism and postmodernism. It addresses the use of archival photographs in Rudy Wiebe's historical fiction, as well as in the work of other Mennonite writers, and discusses the urgent appeals that young poets like Di Brandt and Julia Kasdorf made in their early work to readers they hoped would understand the personal sacrifices they had to make to become writers at all. At the same time, the book probes the fact that Mennonite literary texts have been embraced by many Mennonite readers, besides many, many readers who are not Mennonites, of course, but some of whom among the Mennonites have become distanced from their communities, yet find in their literary texts of Mennonite writers a kind of homeland. One chapter in the book describes the literary ambitions of Ephraim Weber, a Swiss Mennonite from southwestern Ontario, whose unpublished novel about Mennonites, Paul Tiessen and I found after years of searching for it in the National Library and Archives of Canada. Weber was engaged in a lively literary correspondence with Lucy Maud Montgomery for some 40 years, beginning in 1902, 6 years before Montgomery's Anne of Green Gables appeared. His many letters to Montgomery are full of exclamations about how he longed to be a writer and how his Mennonite heritage seemed to have held him back. The Mennonite writers most familiar to a Winnipeg audience are Russian Mennonites, of course. I grew up in Winnipeg, never heard that term Russian Mennonites, but living in Waterloo County, I hear it all the time, of course. And in Canada, at least, these Russian Mennonites dominate the Mennonite literary scene. Well-known Mennonite writers in the USA, on the other hand, and there are many and always more, tend, like Ephraim Weber, to be of Swiss or Amish heritage. Julia Kasdorf, Jeff Gundy, and more recently, Sophia Samatar and Rachel Yoder, for example. Writers and critics of both traditions have collaborated in various ways over the past 35 years, including at 9 international conferences, to form and sustain a truly international literary phenomenon that has come to be known as Mennonites writing. In the afterword to this volume, I remark that I am most persistently intrigued by how authors and texts and contexts interact with each other. To be sure, I read in order to savor the virtuosity of the literary moment, but I think I'm not alone in taking particular pleasure in recognizing a gesture or an emotion that is somehow uncannily familiar. I appreciate how creative people make art out of an everyday that resonates with my own experience. On Mennonites writing is, in many ways, a gift to me, as I hope it will be to others. I take great pleasure in statements from readers who have described the book as accessible, fun to read, and a great gift to anyone interested in this literature, or who have declared, I am loving this book. I've read 5 articles already and find myself resonating with so much. Mennonite writers have, over the almost half a century, created a vibrant and diverse literary landscape. All of us, whatever our background or disposition, can travel through and explore. And this book is something of a pocket guide through that richly textured territory. Thank you.
Thank you, Hildi. And now I will introduce the author of our second book that we are launching tonight. And I shouldn't even need to look at her biography, because this is more or less the third book that CMU Press has done recently by Sarah Klassen. Her novel, The Russian Daughter, came out about 1.5 years ago, and there are copies here tonight. And quite recently, she was involved in a really fascinating translation project with Joanne Epp and Sally Ito. They translated together some 17th century sonnets from the German by Katharina Regina von Greifenberg, and we've called that book Wonderwork. I'm sure you can find it here too. So it's been a pleasure working with Sarah on several projects. Sarah Klassen lives here in Winnipeg and is well known to many of you. Indeed, probably most of you people are all related to each other, except for me. And she's well known not only for her fine writing, but for the support and friendship she extends to so many in the writing community. Since the late 1980s, she has published 4 books of fiction and 8 books of poetry. Her most recent book before this was Wonderwork. She has won many awards. I'll mention a few of them, which would probably embarrass her. The Gerald Lampert Award for her first book of poetry in 1988. 2 National Magazine Poetry Awards, a Word Guild Award, a Canadian Authors Association Award, etc. You know her, and it was such a pleasure to work on this book, and I'm very excited to send it out into the world. Please join me in welcoming and celebrating with Sarah Klassen.
Thank you, Sue. And thank you, Hildi, for giving us a context to this whole project of Mennonite writing. I want to thank very much my publisher, represented by Sue Sorensen. She's already spoken to you. Also, I want to thank Nathan Dueck, who can't be here, and John Dick for the lovely design of the book. It's very pretty. I also want to thank McNally Robinson. It's already been said before, but I just want to underline that, yes, a wonderful bookstore, and John Taves, always so composed and so organized and so helpful, and he's back there somewhere. And a great big thank you is extended to all of you. Here you are, it's June, the weekend, and you are here. Thank you for coming. I don't take it for granted. So I'm going to be reading a few poems. The first poem is called Higher. It begins with a quotation from Origen, who was a 3rd century scholar and theologian. You yourself are even another little world and have within you the sun and the moon and also the stars. Do you see yourself in that quotation? Higher. Hunger for something more than bread drives you to rise up, rise higher, to where the air is thin as a newborn's cry, the view unobstructed. At this height, solitude will be your sole companion. You ascend a mountain towering up from wilderness. Climb a ladder, shimmy up a ladder in a pillar in the desert. You are prepared to leave behind what you cannot carry on your back or in your head. You cannot bring the children. Keep both hands free, one to hold tight while reaching with the other for the next rung. Night falls. Silence surrounds you like a wall. Listen to your own breathing. Give ear to the alarm within. A congregation, a quarreling crowd of shoppers, a kindergarten class. Wisdom vies with triviality, doubt with trust. Rage wants to outshout praise. Are you surprised that you've hauled up with you to this altitude a multitude? The whole world sits at the center of yourself, waiting to be loved, forgiven, reconciled. Morning comes, sun rises. The desert wind blows sand into your eyes. This next poem I'm going to read from is called Traveling with Children, or Sermon Series in a Mennonite Church. Can you hear me? So this is a poem in several parts, and I will just read 3 of the parts. Light poured that morning through stained glass. Rainbow colors fell on us like jewels. We were told to claim clothes from the closets of terrified neighbors who said, take your unleavened bread and go, just go. In the parking lot, we debated, lunch at Perkins or Olive Garden. We marveled at divinity's mysterious ways, how rich we had become. Never mind our children's restlessness, the sun's relentless hammering, dry distances we have to plod between departure and arrival, bearing the wage of plunder. How quickly, in that wilderness, we all grew weary of manna. Sunday after Sunday, we were at the mercy of a company of preachers, ordained or lay, male or female, old, young, educated or not so much, all of them instructing us to set up or collapse our weathered tents. In that blazing desert, we packed and repacked our possessions, rounded up our grumbling children. We wanted an end to wandering, an end to head counts. We wanted the landscape altered, the sky crammed with clouds, able to deliver rain. We wanted water running clear through unfrozen pipes, rust-free, colorless, abundant. The morning Moses split the rock, we were shocked, as if in the midst of a church picnic the heaven opened. The fierce gush caught us off guard. We expected a hymn, announcements, the benediction. Our children opened their parched mouths and drank. One morning, the burning bush became the children's story, their chance to face the sacred, our chance to watch their faces glow as the fire blazed, consuming nothing. Take off your shoes, we said, and they did. Trapped in that desert, we learned that fire, when it is hot enough, will melt gold. Out of gold, we reconfigured God. When Moses climbed down, finally, from the mountain, his face blazed. We raised our hands to shield the faces of our children, then covered our own. In my last book of poetry, The Tree of Life, the central image is a tree, and a tree lifts its branches up to the sky and pushes its roots deep into the earth. And that suggests a connection for me between the material, the physical, and the transcendent or spiritual. So this is one of the poems from that book. I dreamt a tree, neither pine nor palm, in a country I had never traveled. Storms that decimated poplar, birch, and willow could not disturb its sturdy canopy. Its fruit ripened where the hungry gathered, where refugees and strangers rested. I dreamt a sliver in the grass beside a river that flows through a garden. When I awoke, the tree woke with me. Its leaves shone green in vacant spaces of the day, at the crossroads of simplicity and fear, lethargy and reconciliation, Alpha and Omega. I'm going to read now from the part that's called New. I've been reading from the selected, they've all been published before, and these ones have not been collected in any of my books. I'm going to read a poem that's in two parts. It's called Where Were You When? As in, where were you when you heard that Trump had been declared guilty on all counts? A dog leaped out of the ditch to snap at me. I veered to avoid fresh roadkill, pedaled past a golf course, 3 empty churches, a closed country store. On either side, the golden glow of aspen leaves. Above me, screaming geese wedged and wheeled against the flax blue sky. As if I'd need them, some St. Teresa's words entered my head. Let nothing disturb you, nothing frighten you. At the A&W, we praise the perfect autumn day, the blue and gold, the coffee hot and strong. I pedaled home and turned the TV on. What happened on that day is history. Those lethal fires long since doused, debris swept up, the dead identified if possible, mourned, buried, the perpetrators hunted down, and New York reimagined. 2. My mother and I are drinking tea in her tiny room. The nurse brings pills. I turn the TV on. The screen explodes. Chaos at the Kabul airport. Tangled arms reach out for helping hands. Feet for foothold. Mouths gape with horror. A frantic scramble. Rats from a sinking ship. The nurse says, "It's the Taliban." My mother, trembling, asks, "What's Taliban?" I grab the remote. There must be a game show, talk show, cooking show, something that won't frighten my mother, who is frail, confused, dead tired. It's getting late. She should be sleeping. Sometimes when I travel, I write a bunch of poems about that traveling, but this one that I'm going to read was the only one that I wrote after the very last Mennonite cruise in the Ukraine in 2018, I believe. It's called Souvenir. You thought you'd dig up the porcelain cup your grandmother buried beneath an oak tree before she turned her back on the apricot orchard and shut her ear to the nightingale's evening song. You thought you'd find a red brick inscribed with your name. You thought you'd be the one to bring home hidden manna. Porcelain shatters easily as hope. The best bricks crumble. Your grandmother's gone. And what is manna but metaphor? Windows arched like eyebrows, ornate gate posts, stairways curving heavenward. Are they not constructs of desire filtered through time, space, and your imagination? This wooden bench beside the road, it's real. And the women who sit here at dusk with their geese and goats, watching the world rumble past on a potholed road. Their grief is real too, not only what they've lost, but what they've never had. They breathe the evening air and smile at you. And there's your souvenir. If that is not enough, kneel here beside the road. Pick up a small white stone. Pretend your name is written on it. Put it in your pocket. Bring it home. And I'll finish with this one, which brings us back to the Mennonite story. This is a poem about Edison Avenue. I live in the northeast part of Winnipeg. That's where my grandparents settled at the end of Edison Avenue in about 1926. A brief history of Edison Avenue. When you find it, the promised land is a narrow river of mud that wraps itself like glue around your Russian boots and bicycle wheels. The fierce sun grinds it to dust, the wind flings howling in your face. Winters, your children get lost in its white rage. Trees are enemies you didn't expect. You must take the axe to their trunks, burn out their everlasting roots. Evenings, you will dream of the lost paradise, wind breathing through gold-bright wheat fields, fragrance of apple orchards in spring. You will pore over pictures of majestic horses harnessed to your Sunday carriages, camels, herds of fat cattle. Such dreaming must be unlearned. You must never forget God brought you here to tend one tethered cow, a small barn full of leghorns, a kitchen garden where the trees grew. He wants you to love him in a clapboard church you built when you've made the long way home from peddling onions, eggs, your first ripe corn, speaking politely to English ladies in River Heights. Purify your flesh. Scrub from it the sweat of foundries and nurses and sewing factories. Purge from your soul the streetcars jangling. Join the saints arranged in fixed rows, yearning for worthiness. Listen to the choir sing in four-part harmony, in German, a cappella, about carnelian, topaz, dazzling rubies that adorn the New Jerusalem. God's shimmering bride beyond the wide crystal river, its fertile banks moist and cool in the shade of green cedars forever. Thank you.
So now we'll ask these two writers and John Weir to take their seats. And while they're doing that, I'll tell you who John Weir is. We have a few moments for them to have a conversation. So currently, John Weir is working as a counselor as well as a writer, and he's also a serious bird enthusiast. He'd probably rather be doing birds right now. In the past, he's been a luthier, which helps to explain the title of his 2002 poetry collection, The Violin Maker's Lament. He's been involved with many key cultural enterprises in Canada, such as Access Copyright, the League of Canadian Poets. His poetry books include Stand the Sacred Tree and Where Calling Birds Gather. And as was mentioned earlier, Sarah's book is the first in a series called the Lyrik Poetry Series. She's Lyrik 1 and John Weir is going to be Lyrik 2. We're well into it now and it'll be out in a few months. So, John, take it away.
Thank you, Sue. So, Hildi and Sarah, I'm also really pleased to be part of the celebration of your work. and to help honor your work. And with that, maybe I'll start with the first question. Sarah, in your in the afterword of this collection, you tell a story about coming home from school, walking with a friend, and as you walk and as you hold hands, you're reciting poetry to each other. So this obviously was when you were a teen, and of course I'm thinking about the years between when you were a teen and when your first collection came out in 1988. What was happening in those years? What was it that finally got you to begin writing? Or had you been writing all this time?
No, I had not. I was growing up, I guess, for one thing. I actually came to poetry in a very slow way. I was born hungry for stories. I loved stories and I read indiscriminately. And I think for any writer, that's a preparation. Maybe mine was exceptionally long. I had to read a lot of books before I was even ready to write. The idea of writing never occurred to me. I wasn't a child keeping a journal or writing little stories the way some writers have begun. That wasn't me at all. But I became a teacher, as you know, and that had something to do with it, because now all this time I'd been reading very indiscriminately. It didn't matter what I'd been reading indiscriminately. It didn't matter what I was reading. I just devoured the books. I was a consumer of text, and I certainly wasn't a creator of text at all. But I began to think it was a bit odd that I was expecting my students to write. And in grade 11, I think, every year, I assigned to my students, they had to write a story, which was not on the curriculum. It wasn't required. But I did it anyway because I enjoyed reading what they had written. Most of them probably found this quite a torturous experience. And the irony was that I was not writing anything myself, except maybe lists here and there. And it suddenly occurred to me that here I'm telling people what to write, how to write it, and then I'm grading their work afterwards. Anyway, through stories, I came to poetry, which sounds odd, but my very first desire to write came because of a story my mother had told. My mother was a storyteller. That was one of my sources of, I lived in a house with few books, and so there was never enough reading material. Her stories naturally were about Russia, which I didn't like to listen to very much for a long time because that was Russia. I was very aware of the fact that I was the child of immigrants and that in my home we spoke the language of the enemy. Germany was the enemy at the time. But anyway, she told, when I started actually listening to her stories, I remembered there were stories about Yalta, a trip the family took to Yalta. I thought I want to write about that. And so I started to write. I started to want to write, but it was going to be fiction. So how did it become a poem? Anyway, I remember one night thinking, I can't do this. My work desk was covered with students' essays all over the place. And there would be no room for papers of, first, second, third draft of a story. But I thought, I'll write something short. Maybe I'll write a poem. So I started writing poems about the stories of Yalta. That's a long answer.
That was the way I got going.
Yeah, but I came through to poetry through fiction, so to speak.
A lot of reading and eventually writing. Hildi, I imagine you also have some kind of origin story as to becoming a writer. I'm going to ask you questions of yourself as a writer rather than as a critic, maybe. What was your what was your relationship with literature as you were growing up? I mean, by your late teens, you were already studying literature at the university, I gather. What was your course?
Well, it's really interesting to hear what Sarah has to say, because she was reading these long novels, and I was doing less of that than reading poetry. I was always interested in reading poetry, and of course, I mean, I love narrative as well. But I was also attracted. I mean, I think back. You mentioned high school. I remember in high school, a teacher telling me to close the book on my desk because I wasn't following along. It was a Shakespeare class, and I think he was a little embarrassed when he came over and realized that the book on my desk was a variorum, that is a richly documented, richly annotated, critical edition of the Shakespeare text. So I was always really interested not only in the literature, but always what's going on around it, and how can you illumine even the smallest detail, either historical or language or whatever. So.
Were you writing poetry yourself in high school?
I was writing poetry in high school. I was, in fact, I even assigned one of my girlfriends to be my archivist. She came to I came to my love of archives very early, but I kept writing, and then very early in my first year university, one of my friends wanted to show some of my poems to a fellow who was actually an editor of the school paper, I think. And I just happened to be in the hallway when she did this, and he was very dismissive. And I was just shattered enough that I kind of quit writing poetry. So I will write occasionally, but it's too bad because I've been doing it for long. But so I'm sure language teachers
might
appreciate
become
it.
a poet instead of a critic.
I could have maybe.
Sarah, I think research tells us that, studies tell us that most writers that write a book, 9 out of 10 writers that write a book never write a second book. And so my question for you, Sarah, is once you finally got going, what was it that made you the person who kept on writing rather than stopping, as all the 9 out of 10 writers do? What was it that poetry meant to you or gave to you, or what was the thing that kept you going?
I think the 1% of us who keep on writing, we're the ones who get hooked on it, and we find it a challenge and just keep on writing. I think for me, well, we're talking a lot of Mennonite today. Within the Mennonite community, everybody could sing. I thought they sang in choirs or they sang solos or whatever. I couldn't. I did not have a good singing voice. So I felt I think coming to poetry, that was a place where I found a voice. It was something that I could do, and it suited me because it was something I could do by myself, in solitude, which was fine with me, and I continued to do that. I think that I read somewhere that I think the poet Scott Cairns, an American poet, writes something about a text having the power to generate further texts. And I think this happens as I began to attend, for instance, a friend invited me to poetry reading. I started to go to poetry readings. And I think listening to poets reading made me, if it was a good reading, it made me want to go home and write some more, or reading other poetry. So I just kept on, and it was a challenge. It was a sort of a thing that you never, you want to be perfect, but you know you never are or may never be. And I think once I got past the hurdle of accepting the fact that there will be, rejections from the editors and so on, and kept on going, I felt, yeah, this maybe I am supposed to be writing poetry.
Hildi, that first essay in the collection was written in 1973 or published in 1973. Yeah, 50 years ago. What was it kept you going? I suppose it's a little different as an academic. You have to publish to keep your job, in a sense. It's a part of the job. But what was it that writing gave to you, or how did you feel rewarded, or what kept you going with the writing?
Well, I would start with one word, curiosity, and maybe another one, community, and I'll explain the community part, and that is, I just kept writing because, I remember reading a critic way back in university, his name was Mark Shore, he talked about writing as discovery. It was a way to think. You think with, some of us think with our pen, and so there was that, but very early on, I started having the opportunity to be able to host writers for readings and that sort of thing. And then also I started editing, doing a lot of editing of other people's work in Prairie Fire and New Quarterly and so on. And so there was this incredible community that was developing that I had access to, and that was getting, it kept rolling, and I just kept going, and it was curiosity and community, just those two things, I think.
Can I intercept here?
Sure.
I remember that you were so encouraging. I was hosted at your place more than once. You encouraged new writers in a very real way and made opportunity for us for events and so on. And that was a big thing. And back to the other question, an encouragement that kept you going.
Yeah, and it's almost the same as your sense of, you go to a reading, you get excited, you come home, you write. It's a little bit the same kind of impulse.
And people respond to what you're doing in one way or another, and often, in my case, because I was working professionally, institutional support that allowed me to host writers and do that sort, and in the Canada Council and various other ways of participating in what was happening.
Yeah.
So I'm going to jump forward in the script a little bit and skip a couple of things that I sent you. And I want to ask one of the last questions I mentioned. Hildi, one of the points you make in one of the essays somewhere, I forget which one, you talk about you mentioned Patrick Friesen's 1 foot in, 1 foot out. You write about the fact of, or the notion of these writers kind of becoming outsiders, or are you inside, are you outside? I'm curious, Sarah, if, for instance, Patrick Friesen maybe experienced himself as very much stepping out and away from the community. How did you perceive the business of being inside, being an insider or outsider? Did you have the same sense of 1 foot in the community and 1 foot in the outside culture? Or what did you think of that?
You mentioned Patrick Friesen. Of course, at that time I was reading Patrick Friesen, Di Brandt, Rudy Wiebe. They blazed the trail for those of us who followed, and I was very grateful for that. As far as being insider or outsider, I think I've always been more on the periphery of any situation than in the heart of it. And the periphery is sort of They're right on the border. Is that in, or is it partly in or partly out? But let me just tell you one incident. We used to have a CBC radio used to have an arts reporter, and she came around to interview her, maybe after my first book or so. And we talked about various things in that interview, and we talked about these writers, Patrick Fries and Rudy, Di Brandt. And after our conversation, she said, she was off then, she said, no, she has to write the story. And she said, I just have to get the right angle on it. And then, I don't know how she put it, but she said, oh, I've got it. They're over there and you're over here, sort of. She didn't put it that crassly. It made me feel uncomfortable, actually, because I wasn't seeking to be in or out. I have to say, their writing tended to be critical, and their criticism I thought was valid, and I thought they were making a very good job of what they were doing in writing and accomplishing a great deal. And my interests in writing the subjects were quite different, really. And I have to say, I got a lot of support from my Mennonite community, but each Mennonite community is different, or different communities have varying degrees of encouragement or the opposite.
Hildi, if you think of yourself as a writer in this context, was that also a question for you? Here you are writing about inside and outside, but are you also experiencing it as a writer? What was happening for you there?
I was in a very different situation, I think, from the writers who are writing, you know, I mean, I'm thinking about the quotation I uttered earlier from Rudy Wiebe, you know, the creative writers writing about their communities in fairly graphic ways often made themselves much more vulnerable. I was, the whole time that I was writing, I was really writing in the context of Canadian literature generally. And I thought of all these writers as just a group of writers within Canadian literature, and a very vibrant group of writers. They appealed to me, many of them, partly because they were great writers and great performers in readings and so on, and I really enjoyed their work. But I tended not to think of the inside-outside relative to me so much. But the other thing that, in response to your question, is that, and Rob Zacharias has remarked on this, and others perhaps, that my own point of reference was critics who were writing about other communities, the Jewish community or the American, Asian American community, or somebody else. Though that's where I found the kinds of ideas that were stimulating me to think about Mennonite writing. But it was always Mennonite writing within the context of the broad landscape of Canadian literature.
Okay. It's been suggested that this should end at 8. Is that?
Oh, yes, if you have you can feel free to ask another question, John, if you'd like. We can go a little bit over and then we can wind things down just a
Okay. Then, Sarah, you mentioned in your afterword your study of Simone Weil, and I was wondering, was she a really influential writer for you? Is that why you did a collection of poems about her, or what were you, was she that important in your development or in your thinking?
No, I wouldn't say that she was, I wouldn't say that. I was intrigued with her as a person. She was so very different. She was an intellectual, a brilliant woman, a teacher of philosophy, and she was identifying or wanting to identify with the working class. And in doing so, she did all these weird things. Like as a child, she didn't want to eat more than the ration of a soldier in World War I. Or she'd sleep on the floor, and her family was well off. Sleeping on the floor didn't help anybody, but she chose to do that. Or she would she would take time off from teaching philosophy to work in a factory where she was under the pressure of piecework. She had to accomplish so much. She was uncoordinated. She was clumsy. She was weak. And she was doing this work at a time when I'm sure there were no workplace safety rules in place.
You admired her.
So I wouldn't say that she influenced me in my writing, but she became a subject that I became interested in writing about.
Who were the writers that had the greatest impact on you, would you say?
Oh, there were, I guess, a great many. I know one of the first, I tended to concentrate on Canadian poetry when I was beginning to write, because I would be submitting to Canadian literary magazines. And one of the first poets I really admired was Gwendolyn McEwen, because of her musicality and her voice and her worldview, which I'm very far from at the moment. And on a very different level, Margaret Allison, who was intellectual and who wrote through a lens of faith. She inspired me. I could never write like her, but that is not the point. I was inspired by her writing. Lorna Crozier, of course, we all loved Lorna Crozier, and Patrick Lane, who I thought was better than Lorna Crozier. Anyway, there were so many. Yeah.
Hildi, who influenced you? Were you influenced by creative writers? I know you were also influenced by critics. Who were the writers that got you going?
Got me going. I'm not sure, but I mean, in the latter stages of my writing career, I was certainly strongly influenced by other critics. Beginning with people writing about post-colonialism like Homi Bhabha, and then moving on to, well, anybody who reads my last essay will know I've been influenced by an American Jewish writer who works on American Jewish literature, Benjamin Schreier. He's at Penn State. In terms of creative writers, I mean, Rudy Wiebe has always been there. I knew Rudy Wiebe as a young, he was never my teacher, but he was a colleague, and we actually directed a play together in Edmonton back in the 70s, and a friend. And I've always felt that his first novel, Peace Shall Destroy Many, we just mentioned over and over and over again, but I mean, it's hugely prophetic, whatever else it is. I mean, it says so much about everything that came after. And then there would be people like Robert Croach, who did a lot of creative work of his own, but he wasn't Mennonite, but he responded to Mennonites and encouraged them and inspired them. And someone like Di Brandt, who's here, and not only her poetry, but her wonderful literary essays. So there would be, a lot of figures like that.
All right, thanks very much. I, of course, that's 3 questions. I think I have another 10. So we could be here another hour and a half or so probably, but thanks very much for having this conversation. And again, congratulations on a life's work for each of you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John. He gave us some really stimulating questions to think about. It's lovely.
Absolutely.
Thank you all so very much. I'm sure we could have listened to that conversation for another hour and a half. So we're very grateful for all of your thoughts and for sharing your readings with us. And of course, to you, John, for hosting such a vibrant conversation as well. We will be moving along to the signing portion of this evening right now. So in just a moment, Sarah and Hildi will take their place at the signing table. There will be one moment of chaos while we all attempt to line up just down this aisle. Please do feel free to wander up and have a copy of the book signed. You don't need to pay for it first, but we do humbly ask that you pay for it at some point this evening. I would ask all of you to join me one more time in acknowledging all of tonight's participants. So the wonderful CMU Press, of course, represented by Sue Sorensen, now and always. And of course, Hildi Froese Tiessen, Sarah Klassen, and our conversational host, John Weir. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
We created a bit of a trap for you all with the microphone stands. I apologize.
Wow. Oh my goodness. Okay.
Oh yes, I put a fresh glass for you, Sarah, just over at the corner.
Well, it goes back and you did not. Piece of yeah, obviously. I always have to remind you that the cover section is the cover story. So my brother Joe Stern, very often. It's a surprise. Yes, we got.
Yeah.
We had a nice visit with.
Yeah, but you, thank you for your book, but I need you to sign it. And I need to get one for Bill. Yeah, my brother Bill. Yeah.
Oh, man, I would. Okay. You know, not we're gonna see it next time. Yeah, we're having questions sort of on all the work that I'll see them there. They travel so much. Yes, actually, you guys did a lot of
Yeah, for me, yeah.